Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. This is the 17th of November and it's Ignite 2023, which I was just there. And so there's a huge number of updates this week. Now, I am not going to cover the updates around AKS that were announced at KubeCon because I covered those in last week's update. Now, I'm also only going to cover the infrastructure related items around Ignite. What I would highly recommend is to go and look at the Ignite Book of News. This is fantastic. It's huge. It goes through all of the key things that were announced. There's links to particular blogs and more detail about every single thing that was announced. It's just a fantastic read. I actually read it on the plane home yesterday when I flew home Thursday morning. And so if you want all of the detail, go and take a look at that. There was obviously a huge amount around AI, including Microsoft doing 2 new custom chips they have created. So there's some fascinating stuff going on. Copilot, data, huge number of announcements. Speaking of, so in terms of the chapters, I'm only covering the higher level sections. There's still too many to list out every individual one. So I'm being a bit broader with the bookmarks this week. New videos this week. So before I left, I created a video on the Azure Monitor System Center Operations Manager Managed Instance service. So this enables me to have SCOM, but many aspects of responsibility is shifted over as a Microsoft managed service. And I was at Ignite. I was part of the Entra keynote session, which was a huge amount of fun. And so there they did a lot of announcements around passkey support in Authenticator app, the broad availability of the Entra private access and internet access, security Copilot, which I got to demo. And so that was really, really cool. It was an honor to be part of it. And so you can go and check that out as well. So on to what's new. So on the compute side, you can now do an in-place upgrade to Ubuntu Pro. It's a very simple update. I just basically issue a series of CLI commands to firstly enable the Ubuntu Pro, then inside the guest, add in the Advantage tools, but there's no need to redeploy or even take the VM offline. Then you get sort of the 10-year support and there's other capabilities. Azure Boost has gone GA. Now I've talked about this before, but this is about shifting many responsibilities around network and storage from the general hypervisor to dedicated hardware. This therefore frees up more resources for the regular virtualization. It enhances security, but you do get this huge boost in performance for remote storage, local storage, and the network. And different SKUs and services have different metrics for what that performance improvement is. I'll talk about one around the M series, but just in general, yes, it enhances the security because now those actions are on dedicated hardware, but it is going to give you that improvements to performance. AKS Fleet Manager has gone GA. So this is the service that if I think about enterprise at scale management of AKS clusters, this is what provides that capability. And one of the really nice things about this is I can group my AKS clusters. And then with those groups, I can stage and deploy updates over different runs of those groups. So for example, hey, I have a test group of clusters. Well, let's do the new AKS Kubernetes version. Once I'm satisfied, now I'll deploy that to the next group of clusters. So it gives me that safe deployment process for really enterprise level AKS. So that is a huge, powerful capability. And of course, there were a lot of other AKS updates announced at KubeCon. Azure Functions has a new Flex plan in preview. Now, this is in early access preview, so you have to sign up. It's like the consumption plan, but it includes things like private networking. So that might be something you're interested to go and have a look at. There's the new V6 version of the DAEA and FA. So little a means it's the AMD-based processors. So this is the 4th gen AMD EPYC CPUs. Obviously, D is the general purpose, E is the memory optimized, F is the compute optimized. So now you're going to get improvements really across the board, but depending on what is my workload, what shape compared to memory and CPU ratios does it need, well, there's a SKU that fits your requirements. Azure VM Hibernation is now available in preview. Now remember, the whole point of Azure is we pay for when the compute is provisioned. And so often we'll stop the compute, so we stop paying the compute charges. We still pay the storage for the managed disks, but we stop paying the compute. When we stop it, we lose the state of what is in memory. Hibernation enables us to save that state to the OS disk so that when we start it again, it's up and running, the same as your regular desktop PC. That's really going to be advantageous if it's potentially virtual desktop scenarios, or if I need to pre-warm up the operating system. Maybe there's a whole set of things it has to do when it starts. So I want to do all of those tasks, hibernate it, so then when I do have to start it, it's instantly ready to go. Now, it's only supported for certain VM SKUs. It's only supported for certain operating systems. Obviously, Windows, I'll have to move the page file off of the temp disk because it is going to save the memory to disk and then deprovision it from the host. Well, the temp disk lives on the host, so when you hibernate, you will lose the temp disk. So I can't have the page file sitting on the temp disk. So you'll have to relocate the page file, off of the temp disk to the OS disk, for example. And then you'll be able to do that hibernation and bring it back. So there's a few caveats to it, but I think this is going to be really useful for some key scenarios. Azure Marketplace now supports ARM-based solutions. So this is really just those ARM-based architectures. It's going to enable that broader adoption by making them more available in the marketplace. And now we have confidential VMs with Intel TDX in preview. So TDX is the trust domain extensions. Now we've already got confidential compute with the Intel SGX, the software guard extensions. But remember, with the Intel SGX, it was this custom enclave that I had to write my application to leverage. So I had to make app changes. With the TDX, it's hardware level whole VM protection. So I don't have to change my app at all to get the benefit from it. So it's hardware isolated. So there's going to be a DC for general purpose and then EC for those memory optimized, memory centric workloads. Confidential VM disk integrity tooling. So if I think about the whole point about integrity is from the firmware all the way through into the operating system, there's measurement, there's attestation that nothing has been changed. Well, now I can also apply this to the disk. So it's going to add the measurement, the attestation that the OS disk is launched as expected. There's not been any tampering with that. And now confidential VM temp disk encryption. The managed disks, obviously I can encrypt with a confidential VM. The memory is encrypted, but that temp disk that lives on the host previously was not encrypted. It's still not encrypted by default, but I can opt in to enable that temp disk to be encrypted. There are a few requirements and prereqs for that. Check the documentation. Continuing on compute, now I can have confidential VMs with NVIDIA H100 Tensor Core GPUs. So I can have confidential compute that has GPUs. That's going to be really useful for those GPU intensive type workloads. This is going to be a lot around AI. When I think about training, when I think about fine tuning, all those popular open source models, large language versions, large language models, etc. I'm going to be able to leverage this. Once again, I don't have to change my code. And what's happening here is there's going to be a secure channel established between the GPU driver and then the actual GPU itself. So it's still encrypted going between what is the OS and the GPU. Trusted launch is now going to be the default when I create a VM from the Azure CLI or PowerShell. Obviously, trusted launch is built on the Generation 2 VMs where it has the virtual TPM, where I get things like that measured boot, all those protections to ensure there's nothing interrupting bad things in the process. AKS cost analysis add-on is in preview. So if I think about an AKS cluster, there's a whole set of underlying infrastructure resources. And what this is going to let me do is see the underlying costs based on cluster or namespace. And it's built on the open cost CNCF project. Now, this is only available in the standard and premium AKS tiers, not the free tier. But hey, if I want to get those expanded views into my costs, maybe divide it up into different applications that share a cluster, that's going to be super useful. Kubernetes has an AI toolchain operator. So this is an open source project that really just automates the deployment of large language models on, in this case, AKS. So it's going to make it, again, everything's around AI and making AI more available. You're going to see that in a lot of these updates, and this just helps us get those deployed more easily. Azure Container Apps, remember, Azure Container Apps enable me to much easier get my microservice, my distributed applications that are container-based deployed. It abstracts away AKS, but it adds the CADA scaling, it adds Dapper for a lot of those capabilities, network functions, it abstracts all that away. Well, now there's a version with a GPU profile. So the profile dictates, hey, is it consumption? Is it a dedicated plan? If it's dedicated, which this is a new type of, is it general purpose? Is it memory optimized? Well, now there's one with this GPU. So I have the ability to have those NC A100 V4 series GPUs, which is really geared towards AI training and batch inferencing. I can leverage that now with those container-based workloads that I deploy to Azure Container Apps. Also now I have ACA policy-driven resiliency. So one of the things Dapper actually brings is a set of resiliency features. There's retries, there's back off, there's circuit breaker, there's different ways to handle different types of failure. Well, Dapper brings a lot of those to us very, very simply. Well, this is a way to hook into those Dapper features without having to really do anything in my application. So it's a very simple way to get up and running on that. Also, they've got an enterprise landing zone for Azure Container Apps now for those secure enterprise scale deployments. And there's also support for the CNCF compatible build packs. That enables me to take my code and just build it, package it, ready for a cloud deployment. So that is just now there. And then Azure Container Apps have vector database add-ons. So you're going to hear about vector databases all of the time, and it's related to artificial intelligence. So a regular database, we might have columns that are indexed based on text, which we search on. So we have to have the exact word. That's not very useful in a lot of the AI context where we want to be able to search for maybe similar things. We want to be able to search images and audio and video. So what vectors do is it converts the text, it runs it through a model, and it comes out with a vector. We think of this very long floating point sequence of numbers that represents that. And computers are very good at dealing with numbers, so that vector embedding that number-based version of whatever the input was is very powerful to then go and look up and leverage with our AI. And so it's now giving me, I think it's 3 add-ons for some of the most popular vector databases, so I can hook in and leverage those vector databases from my Azure Container App. So you're going to see this vector all over the place. Just think of it as regular text is not that great when I want to try and inference and work things out related to something someone types in, because it has to really match on the word. When I convert that to a vector embedding arrays of floating point long numbers, well, then that's math. It's easier to find similar things, which is exactly what we want to be able to do. So you're going to see that all over the place. The MV3, medium memory virtual machines, have gone GA. This is one of those things that has taken advantage of Azure Boost. So that gets 25% network improvement and 50% remote storage improvement over the V2. And I think it ranges from a 250 gigabyte to a 4 terabyte memory model. It's also got new features to give enhanced resiliency against memory failures, against disk failures, against network failures. Virtual machine scale sets have a number of enhancements. So I can now convert a VM scale set that was just regional to zonal, i.e., hey, I want it to use AZ1, AZ2, and AZ3 without having to redeploy it. So I can just use an AZ command to say, hey, I now want you to be AZ123. I would then have to deploy new instances and then delete the old ones. It's not going to move the existing ones into zones, but I convert the VMSS to zone redundant, deploy new instances, delete the old ones that were just regional. And I've now gone from 99.95% SLA to a 4.9s SLA. So a very simple process without any downtime. Also, we can now attach and detach VMs from a virtual machine scale set flex. Now that zonal expansion was for the uniform and the flex orchestration mode. Uniform was our original, flex is the new flexible model. This is only for flexible, but I can take an existing VM and just add it into a VMSS flex set, or take a VM from a VMSS flex and take it out. Attach, detach is in preview. And RHEL 9.3 is now supported in VMs in Azure. That's now gone GA. Onto networking. So this is cool. Light is only so fast, and it's only so fast in a vacuum. When I put light over a fiber cable, it's a lot slower than in a vacuum. What Microsoft have done is develop their own fiber cables. It has a hollow core, and what that means is the protons can travel faster. I think it's up to a 47% improved speed. So they're developing their own fiber cables that they're currently rolling out. I think the UK are getting it first. But if I can increase the speed of light over fiber, if I think a region is normally 2 millisecond latency envelope, well, now I can make that actually a bigger physical area. If I think of an availability zone as its own envelope, I can make that bigger as well. And then we can start increasing speeds between regions. So this is a really cool thing. They're manufacturing it themselves as well. And so we'll start to see those things speed up. ExpressRoute had a whole number of updates. So in GA, ExpressRoute is now a trusted service. So what that means is, if I'm using MaxSec, which is where, if I'm using ExpressRoute Direct, I have my router and then the Microsoft Enterprise Edge router, MaxSec lets me do encryption between those two routers at the meet me point. Well, now I can store the key in an Azure Key Vault. And if I have a firewall in front of it, I can configure it to allow trusted services, which will now allow ExpressRoute to be able to go and get the key from it. Also now, if I'm using ExpressRoute Direct, remember where I get the entire port, the ExpressRoute Direct can be in a different subscription than the subscription I create the circuits. So that will enable me to spread out management and maybe even costs if I'm doing certain per circuit costs like premium, for example. In preview, they now have a scalable gateway. So there's different SKUs of the gateway, which is where the control and the data path flow through. With the scalable gateway, as the name suggests, it can scale between a minimum and maximum number of instances. And I can actually get up to 40 gigabits per second on that data path. Now, obviously, if I'm using FastPath, the data path doesn't go through typically the gateway anyway, so it will be less applicable. But if I'm not using FastPath, or it's a service that doesn't support FastPath today, that scalable gateway may be very, very useful. There's also now a seamless gateway migration, so I can move from a non-AZ enabled gateway to an AZ enabled gateway without the need to delete and recreate the resource. There's some features not supported, like FastPath, route server, VPN coexistence with site-to-site, but make sure you check out the docs for all the detail. And again, for ExpressRoute Direct, I can now do rate limiting. So when I create the circuits on ExpressRoute Direct, it doesn't actually limit the circuit to the bandwidth I set. So I could potentially have a circuit use more than it should and interfere with others. On a per circuit level, I can turn on rate limiting, which will now force it to the actual bandwidth of the circuit. And then for ExpressRoute gateways, site-to-site VPN gateways, including ones used by virtual WAN, I can now have a customer-controlled maintenance. So this is a daily minimum 5-hour window that I can configure that will specify, hey, when I would like gateway to be performed. Now, generally, maintenance shouldn't interfere anyway because there's most time active and it will move traffic over, but you may see certain blips depending on the retry traffic in your app. So this now enables you to move that maintenance, which should be outside your common busy windows. Azure Virtual Network Manager security admin rules have gone GA. So remember, Azure Virtual Network Manager is that enterprise scale centralized management of your virtual networks. Enables me to define the connectivity I want, different patterns, mesh or hub and spoke. But it also has these security admin rules, which are like network security groups. But think of funnels. So the security admin rules get applied first, and then only if it lets the traffic through those centrally defined rules will it then hit the NSG defined at the subnet or on the NIC itself. So these have now gone GA to enable me to have those absolutely must be enforced rules that I don't want to do at an NSG level. And then private subnet is in preview. I've talked about it before that the implicit internet access is going away, I think it's September 2025. And I have to have an explicit option. NAT gateway, an Azure firewall, a standard external load balancer. Well, if I turn on this switch at a new subnet level, it's turning default outbound access to false. It will now use that new behavior straight away. So there won't be any implicit. I'll have to have an explicit internet action defined. On the database side, so Oracle database at Azure is GAing in December for East US. Remember, this is taking the Exadata Oracle hardware, it's putting it in Azure data centers on which I can run rack databases. And it's the only cloud service outside of Oracle's own that's going to enable me to have this. So what that would mean is I can now run those rack databases in Azure data centers and get super low latency between my other Azure Compute, AI, everything else service. And other regions will roll out in 2024. Azure SQL Hyperscale has got lower pricing. So what they're really doing here is they're changing the pricing model to be matching commercial open source solutions. So Hyperscale, remember, separates the compute from the page servers. So I get massive scale, massive performance. But this will mean, I think it's about up to a 35% reduction in cost. And you're only going to pay for the storage capacity, not the IOs anymore. So this is a nice change. Cosmos DB scaling is now in preview. And what this really is talking about is dynamic scaling either per partition and per region. It just means if my workload against my Cosmos DB, the request units I require differ, rather than having to scale it all uniformly, I could scale it differently in one region from another region or one partition different from another partition. It really just helps me optimize my costs. Cosmos DB for MongoDB vCore, there's been a whole number of announcements. Some are GA, some are preview. So if I think about the GA, well, it's gone GA. So it's a fully managed database for MongoDB workloads. There is a free tier available. I think it's 32 gigabytes of storage, and I can get one free per subscription. And if I like what it does, if I've got it worked out, I can then upgrade it to a paid tier to expand its capabilities. There's also vector search in Cosmos DB for this MongoDB vCore. And as I mentioned before, that vector search you're going to see everywhere because it's everything about AI. The ability to convert data into these vector embeddings, these floating point arrays of numbers, is far better for computers to work with and find similar things, not exact matches, which I just can't do with a regular index on text. So you're going to see this vector, the ability to take text, run it through the model to get the vector embedding and then store it back. You're going to see this everywhere. So I have that vector search available for MongoDB. And then in preview, if I'm using the new Azure OpenAI services, well, there's the ability to use your own data for that retrieval augmented generation, i.e., when I'm trying to make a call to the large language model, it wants to go and hook into my data to go and maybe search for things based on those vector embeddings. Well, there's a really easy integration with this MongoDB. I can just say, hey, use my own data, point it at the instance, and it will be able to go and use that. There's also, as part of the Azure Data Studio, it gives me the ability to migrate from MongoDB to the Cosmos DB for MongoDB very, very simply. It will actually go and give me guidance on any incompatibilities and then actually aid me in that migration effort. There were some other Cosmos DB announcements. I think there was the ability for a NoSQL API to do a cross-account copy. And also there's now a priority-based execution. So if I have multiple different executions going, and obviously a Cosmos DB has a certain number of request units, if I'm going to get throttled because I'm doing too much work, I can set certain sets of execution as a higher priority. So it will get the request units and the lower priority ones won't. So I won't throttle the most important items. So that's a pretty cool thing. PostgreSQL Flexible had a number of updates in preview. So we can now use Premium SSD v2, which is that sub-millisecond latency. It can have IOPS scaling to give me a temporary boost to my higher IOPS when required. And I can do compute and storage scaling with near zero downtime now. It has private endpoint support, again in preview. That's an alternative to the current VNet injection. And there's also a PostgreSQL AI extension. And there's two flavors of this capability set. One is from PostgreSQL Flex, I can now call in to an Azure OpenAI service to send it data. It will run it through a model to create those vector embeddings, those floating point arrays, and then give it back to me that I can then store in the database for future AI interactions. And then it can also call into Azure AI Search, which was formerly Azure Cognitive Services, if I have my data and I want to perform sentiment analysis, language detection, etc. It also has a long-term backup for up to 10 years. And then SQL Server had a number of updates. It now has, for Azure SQL Database, the ability to have that always encryption using virtualization-based security, VBS. So that means I don't have to use confidential computing SKUs. It will work on anything. And then Azure SQL Managed Instance had its November update wave. It now has faster initial provisioning. I think it's 30 minutes. I can have zone redundancy for business critical SKUs. I can stop a general purpose SKU to stop paying the compute and the SQL licensing charges. And it supports distributed transactions using the Microsoft Distributed Transaction Coordinator. And then we have this online disaster recovery for SQL Server 2022 to SQL Managed Instance. So that's in preview. And that's using that link feature of SQL Server 2022. So I can host the SQL Server 2022 anywhere. And then I can have that link to my SQL Managed Instance Managed Service. And it gives me a near real-time data replication using SQL Always-On technology. So that's really good for those DR scenarios, maybe even helping my migration. And then miscellaneous, Copilot for Azure. Again, it's Copilot for everything, bringing those large language models to everything we do. This one's super interesting. Now, it's available. You have to go and sign up for it. I think it's enterprise customers only at this time. But it's going to do inferencing, i.e. prediction assistance via the Azure Resource Graph, which remember has access to everything in your entire Azure subscriptions that you have permissions to. So it knows all about your resources, including your Arc-enabled resources. It can then write Custo query language queries against that data. So you ask it for some information, it will create the KQL and give you those answers. It can generate scripts using Azure CLI to perform actions. Hey, shut down all the VMs with this tag. Hey, here's some CLI. Do you want me to run that for you? It can interact with all your metrics and then visualize them for you. And it's got rich interactions with things like Azure Kubernetes services to enable it to actually go and deploy applications. It also has rich interactions with Cosmos DB, so it can go and write your data questions into NoSQL and then explain exactly what it's doing. And it's integrated with all the Azure docs, so it is all-knowing. Azure Migration Application and Code Assessment is GA. So that's the assessment for .NET and Java applications, and it helps move that into app services. Cost management now exports in the focus formats. This is the FinOps open cost and usage specification. Basically, it's a common format that is service agnostic. So now I can, from Microsoft Cost Management, just export in that format and use with any tools that use that common format. I can now have alerts as event grid destinations for key vault events. So, hey, my certificate, my secret is about to expire or has expired. Instead of me having to write something to go and check for that, I can now just use event grid that will call the handler to perform whatever actions I want against those events. Azure Monitor Agent now has JSON log collection. So if I have some JSON formatted logs, my service, my application, I can now just ingest them very easily with the Azure Monitor Agent. Remember, the Azure Monitor Agent is the replacement for the deprecated Log Analytics Agent. So now it makes it very easy to get that data into my Log Analytics workspace and then run analysis against it. Azure Load Testing now has Chaos Studio integration in GA, and this is huge. If we think about Azure Load Testing is all about the ability to perform generation of user load or different types of session load using JMeter scripts, it makes total sense that I can now call that from Azure Chaos Studio, which is designed to replicate certain types of faults because I want traffic running through it. So now in my experiment, what I can actually do is at a certain point choose to start a load test, have a failure, and then stop the load test. So this makes complete sense to have those integrations because honestly, one without the other is not that useful. So I want to be able to run loads through as I'm introducing those failures. And speaking of which, Azure Chaos Studio has gone GA. So that ability to introduce those failures of all different types is now openly available. There's also some experiment templates available to get me started quicker. Today, that's focused around Azure AD, although we're not supposed to say that anymore, Entra outages and availability zone outages. And then Connection Monitor that helps me track connectivity between different sources and destinations now supports the Azure Monitor Agent for those integrations instead of the deprecated Log Analytics Agent. And finally, Windows 365 had a number of updates. Now, actually, single sign-on is available and passwordless authentication. That's also for Azure Virtual Desktop. There's a new GPU offering for Windows 365. I think there's 3 different sizes based on the amount of video RAM I require. And there's a new Windows app available for Windows 365, for Azure Virtual Desktop, for Azure DevBox, for remote desktop services, etc. And that is it. So a huge number of updates. Obviously, I had to go through them pretty fast because there were so many. Check out the Ignite Book of News. I'm sure they'll be making the videos available. And until the next video, take care.